Modern APIs oftentimes are a mix of synchronous and asynchronous, and a popular way of doing asynchronous are webhooks. And then you can ask yourself, how do people use webhooks? And an interesting report came out just recently by Svix, and with me here I have Ken Ruf of Svix. You just published a report on webhooks. And first of all, thanks a lot for joining, and thanks for being on this channel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I want to dig a little bit into the report. So, of course, I'll link it from the description. So, if people want to check it out, they should. It's not super long to read, but I think there are a lot of interesting numbers in there. And maybe you can give us a very brief, just what was the motivation to publish such a report? I mean, I always appreciate these reports because it's hard to get to these numbers. So, why did you do it?
Yeah, so the main reason was we wanted to have an understanding of A, just how much webhooks are getting adopted, and then B, how much of the best practices getting adopted. And then we added a little bit of internal Svix data to get an idea of like, are those best practices actually useful? Like, what is the actual effect of them?
I think it's a really interesting thing to do. So you have hundreds of customers. You said you're supporting kind of billions of webhook messages being sent around per year. So you have quite a bit of insight into what happens. So let's just jump into it. And first of all, the first part looks at popular APIs. So you kind of analyzed the top 100 APIs. I think
I
that's what you
grabbed
said, right?
somebody else's list to try and be as impartial as possible.
Yeah.
And I just went down the list and read all of their documentation.
Okay, yeah. So I guess you have to go with something. Um, and of those, to me, one of the most surprising numbers from your report was that 83% of those APIs use webhooks. I was really kind of blown away by that number. I never would have guessed something even near that. So why do you think that is? I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, my suspicion is just the more mature your API is, right? So to make it onto the top 100 list, you're probably already a pretty well-known API, pretty established. And so in those cases, you're probably offering more of these, ancillary features around your API like webhooks.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And after that as well, it's like, yeah, these are just pretty polished products, and
Yeah.
some part of it is asynchronous because that's probably convenient. But then digging deeper, you found out that of those 83%, only 67% support retries, which then again to me seemed pretty low, given that these are polished APIs, and then no retries doesn't look super polished. So what do you think about that relatively low number?
Yeah, I think that's mainly because the retries is really where the complexity comes in. And so if you're trying to make a decision of, okay, we're going to launch this webhook feature, how much do we want to put into it? The retries is really where, it gets a lot more difficult. And so if you're just firing and forgetting an API call every time the event happens, it's like very simple to do. So the operational burden and the lift to implement such a feature is pretty low. But if you want to do things well, do things right, offer the retries to make things more reliable and scalable, it becomes a lot harder. So I think a lot of people kind of just decided that that trade-off is probably not worth it for them based on maybe like how many of their customers were asking for it and how critical the data is that they're actually seeing in the webhooks.
And then you were digging even deeper and looked into those supporting retries, and you looked at what they do there, and you found, I think, another interesting thing. So what was your next kind of discovery when you looked into how retries are actually done?
Yeah, so the best practice that we recommend for offering the retries is to send them in what is called an exponential backoff schedule. And so essentially you're increasing the duration between retries that you're sending. And the reason why you want to do this is to not flood a customer with retries. If you're doing it linearly every 10 seconds or something, you kind of burn through the retries in a very short amount of time. And so if the issue with the endpoint was intermittent, you're kind of like sending all of the retries during the problem time. Whereas if you kind of like stretch it out, it might succeed later when that intermittent failure subsides.
And then one last thing in that kind of retry story you also looked at is whether you can manually retry things, which I think
Correct.
probably is useful after you've done some recovery, right? Then you can see,
Exactly.
well, is it working again? And how many services did support this kind of manual way where I can trigger retries manually?
Yeah, so you're definitely right. With the manual retries, it's extremely useful once something has failed and you're trying to debug and you think you've fixed your endpoint, right? You want to be able to just click a button and test the manual retries from there. So that was about 14% of all the companies we looked at, 21% of the companies that are offering actual retries. And so it's also kind of a consequence of the exponential backoff schedule, right? Because the timing gets longer towards the end. Once you've fixed it, you don't want to like wait 5 hours for the next retry in the schedule. You kind of just want to click a button and trigger the retry manually.
Okay, so I think that already shows us that there is some complexity to how to implement webhooks, and not everybody does it in the same way. Now, that was about those 100 popular APIs. You also looked a little bit at the data that Svix itself is collecting as part of providing the service for customers with their webhooks. What was like an interesting part there that you found, like some interesting data that you found looking into that data?
Yeah. So obviously the motivation for looking at our own data was we wanted to understand, okay, like we're recommending these best practices like retries, exponential backoff, but is it actually useful? Right. So you can offer 10 retries, but if every single retry you send fails, it doesn't seem that useful. And so when we looked at our internal data, what we found is that about 4.2% of all of the messages, the initial messages that we're sending, are requiring retries. So they fail that first attempt. So just kind of like giving up on 4.2% of your messages and just having them fail and your customers not receiving that information. That's where then we looked at, okay, like once those fail, how successful are the retries that we're offering to our customers? And so what we found is a little over 70% of that 4.2% of failures end up succeeding at one of the retries in the future, right? So you're gaining quite a bit back on that error rate by offering the retries.
Yeah, so then the overall failure rate drops to, I don't know, 1 or 2% or something, right? Which is
Right,
at some point, I
exactly.
mean, there's nothing you can do about that, but that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
some
that's,
some are just going to persistently fail. But it's also nice from if you're the one providing the webhooks, to be able to show your customers, well, actually, here we
yeah.
tried 10 times
Yeah.
to send you this message and it failed
Yeah.
every time. So clearly, if you can show that, then you can go to your customers and be like, hey, like you need to fix your endpoint.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? As for you as a provider of webhooks, basically you could just say, well, I did what I can, and
Exactly.
if it's not working, it's not on me. Yeah, I like that. So I think when we look at those things, we can come away with a conclusion that webhooks are popular and they're not trivial. So there is some stuff to look at. And I, like a little while ago, I made this video around standard webhooks, and I know that Svix also was part of the group that developed standard webhooks. Could you very briefly just say what standard webhooks are and how it kind of connects to what we're talking about here?
Sure. So, in making this report, I think out of the 100 API companies that we looked at and all the different things that we evaluated, there were no two implementations that were the same, right? Every single one was different on some dimension. And at some level, you're going to have that because, different products have different requirements. But what we wanted to try and do, seeing that variation in implementation, was okay, can we at least standardize a bit of it? Right. So the standard webhook effort is like a collection of best practices, um, to just show people, hey, like this is actually how you should be implementing webhooks. So people have kind of a starting point, and then from there they can decide, okay, this feature works for us, this feature doesn't.
Yeah, and that's, I think, that's helpful. So yes, it's not a standard, I would say, in the strict sense of the word, but on the
Yeah.
other hand, it's a good starting point. If you say, I want to do webhooks well, then that's a good thing to look at, right? So if you
Yeah.
follow that, then you probably do a good job. And if you look at it and say, that seems complicated, then I guess Svix has something to offer, right?
Yeah, so Svix is a company. Essentially, our product is, the implementation of standard webhooks, essentially. And we just make it super easy to offer all of these best practices kind of out of the box. So we've had customers, launch within days, with all of these great features that would take,
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit more time and effort to design and then to actually implement and build them.
Okay, so thanks a lot for walking us through the report. I think there are some interesting observations in there, and I think it's at least something to be aware of. That webhooks are probably useful, and a lot of APIs use them. Also, they're not trivial to implement, and that if you want to do it well, there are best practices to follow, and there are services that you can use if you don't feel like implementing themselves. So yeah, thanks a lot, Ken, for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Letting me kind of talk through the report. It took some time to put together, so it's kind of nice to see people appreciate it.
Yes, please keep doing that. I really love whenever those reports come out. I think it's just data that it's hard to get together. So if somebody does it and publishes it, it's really great for the community, I think. Good. So thanks everybody for watching. If you found this interesting, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. And with that, we're done for today. And I think this time I can say, keep getting webhooks to work. Just a little subset. So bye, everybody.